When we think of the ultimate warrior, we think of Sparta. We see the 300 standing against 1,000,000. We see the crimson cloaks, the bronze shields, and the unbreakable will. We have turned Sparta into a symbol of freedom, masculinity, and perfection. From gym bros to politicians, everyone wants to be a Spartan.
But this image is a lie. It is a mirage created by the Spartans themselves and polished by centuries of propaganda. The reality of Sparta was not a glorious action movie. It was a dystopian nightmare. It was a totalitarian state that exercised total control over every breath its citizens took. It was a society paralyzed by the fear of its own slaves. It was a place where art, philosophy, and individuality were strangled in the crib.
If you were transported back to 5th century BC Sparta, you wouldn't be fighting gloriously at Thermopylae. You would likely be starving, beaten, or murdered by your own government. Today, we are going to peel back the layers of the Spartan myth. We are going to walk through the streets of the real Sparta. And by the end of this video, you will understand why the perfect warrior society was actually a hell on earth. To understand the Spartan psychology, we must first look at their economy. And their economy was simple: slavery. Every ancient society had slaves. Athens had slaves. Rome had slaves. But Sparta was different. In other cities, slaves were foreigners bought and sold. In Sparta, the slaves were the neighbors. Centuries before the famous battles, Sparta conquered the neighboring region of Messenia. They enslaved the entire population. These people were called the Helots. The numbers are terrifying. Historians estimate that for every one Spartan citizen, there were 7, maybe 10 Helots. Imagine living in a house where you are outnumbered 10 to 1 by people who hate you. People who remember that this land was theirs.
This demographic imbalance created a deep, primal fear in the Spartan heart. The entire Spartan military system was not designed to fight the Persians or the Athenians. It was designed to fight the Helots. Sparta was a prison where the guards were permanently under siege. The Greek historian Plutarch tells us that the Spartans treated the Helots with a cruelty that shocked even other slave-owning Greeks. They forced them to drink unmixed wine until they were dangerously drunk, and then dragged them into the mess halls to show young Spartan boys what shame looked like. "Look at the beast," they would say, "do not be like him." But humiliation was the least of their worries. Every year upon taking office, the Spartan ephors, the magistrates, would formally declare war on the Helots. Pause and think about that. A government declaring war on its own workforce. Why did they do this? To cleanse themselves of blood guilt. Since they were at war, killing a Helot wasn't murder, it was an act of war. This leads us to the Crypteia. This was the Spartan secret police, composed of the most promising young men. Armed only with daggers, they were sent into the countryside at night. Their mission? To murder. They didn't kill criminals, they killed the strongest, the bravest, and the most capable Helots. If a slave looked you in the eye too confidently, he disappeared. It was a systematic culling of the herd to prevent revolution.
So how do you turn a human being into a cold-blooded suppressor of rebellions? You destroy his humanity before he hits puberty. This brings us to the Agoge, the state education. At age 7, a Spartan boy died to his family. He was taken from his mother and placed in the communal barracks. From this moment on, the state was his father and mother. The Agoge was not a school. It was a survival camp. The boys were given one garment to wear year-round: no shoes. This was to harden their feet and their bodies against the cold of winter and the heat of summer. They were deliberately starved. The rations provided were just enough to keep them from dying, but never enough to stop the hunger pangs. Why? The elders claimed it made them tall and lean, but the real reason was to teach them to steal.
Stealing food was encouraged. It taught stealth and cunning, skills needed for the krypteia later in life. But there was a catch. If you were caught stealing, you were beaten mercilessly, not because stealing was wrong, but because you were clumsy enough to get caught. There was a famous Spartan legend that sums up this mentality. A boy stole a fox cub and hid it under his cloak. As he stood in formation, the agitated fox began to scratch and bite into his stomach. To avoid being caught and shamed, the boy stood perfectly still, showing no pain, until he dropped dead. The fox had gnawed through his internal organs. The Spartans told this story with pride. To us, it sounds like psychosis. It shows a society where appearance and obedience were valued higher than life itself.
If you survived the Agoge, you became a homoios, an equal. But equal didn't mean free. Until the age of 30, you lived in the barracks, even if you were married. You had to sneak out at night to see your wife and sneak back before dawn. Your life revolved around the syssitia, the common mess hall. Every citizen had to contribute a specific amount of food, barley, wine, cheese, figs, to the mess. If you couldn't pay your dues, perhaps your farm had a bad year, you lost your citizenship, just like that. You were demoted to an inferior. And the food? It was legendary for being terrible. The staple dish was black broth, pork boiled in blood and vinegar. A visitor from Sybaris, after tasting it, famously said, "Now I understand why the Spartans are so willing to die. Who would want to live if they had to eat this?"
However, amidst this darkness, there was one group that had it surprisingly better than anyone else in Greece: the Spartan women. While women in democratic Athens were kept indoors, uneducated, and treated like children, Spartan women were a force of nature. They were educated. They learned to read, write, dance, and recite poetry. They engaged in physical sports, running, wrestling, and discus throwing, often completely nude, just like the men. The logic was simple. Strong women produced strong sons.
Because the men were always away at war or in the barracks, Spartan women ran the economy. They managed the estates, controlled the finances, and inherited land. By the 4th century BC, women owned roughly 40% of all land in Sparta. Other Greeks were horrified by this. Aristotle, the great philosopher, blamed women for Sparta's decline, calling the society a gynecocracy, ruled by women. He claimed they were arrogant and lived in luxury while the men suffered. But in truth, they were the only thing holding the economy together. But no amount of strong women or brutal training could save Sparta from its fatal flaw. It refused to change. Sparta was rigid. They feared outside ideas so much that they periodically expelled all foreigners, xenolasia, to keep their culture pure. They refused to update their currency, using heavy iron bars instead of silver coins to discourage trade and wealth accumulation. And most critically, they refused to let new blood in. The Agoge was so brutal and the requirements for citizenship so high that the population of citizens plummeted. In 480 BC, there were 8,000 Spartan citizens. By 371 BC, at the Battle of Leuctra, there were barely 1,000. At Leuctra, the Theban general Epaminondas shattered the Spartan myth. He didn't fight fair. He arranged his troops in a massive, deep column that smashed through the thin Spartan line. The Spartans, paralyzed by tradition, didn't know how to react. They died. And when the Thebans marched into the Peloponnese and freed the Helots, Sparta broke. Without their slaves, they were nothing. The warrior state didn't have anyone left to make the sandwiches.
Sparta didn't disappear with a bang, but with a whimper. In the centuries that followed, it became a caricature of itself. Under the Roman Empire, Sparta became a tourist attraction. Rich Romans would travel there to watch the Diamusti Gosis,
the ritual whipping of boys, which had been turned into a spectator sport with an amphitheater built around it. The descendants of Leonidas were reduced to performing their ancestors' brutality for the amusement of tourists.
So the next time you see a movie glorifying the Spartan way, remember the cost. Sparta achieved military perfection, but at the price of their humanity. They left us no great art, no great plays, no advancements in science. Athens gave us democracy, philosophy, and tragedy. Sparta gave us the word laconic and a lesson in how not to build a society. They were the greatest warriors of their age, but they were prisoners of their own design. Would you trade your freedom for that kind of strength? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more history that ruins your childhood heroes.